So, Jacobs, it's great to be back on History Valley, and we're back with the subject of the synoptic problem and the specific question of whether Matthew copied Luke's gospel. And I know you've had some other guests who've talked about this subject, and it's really interesting to see it being approached from different angles. So today I'm going to try and be as simple as I can to see if we can just take the clearest route to the argument for Matthew using Luke. But of course, when you try and keep it simple, there are things that are a little bit more complicated than you're really saying. So it's very hard to find the right balance. The synoptic problem, at its most basic, if we accept that there's direct copying between the gospel writers, is the question of who copied who, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's been a lot of discussion about this for about 250 years. And so if we're still not sure what the solution is, a pretty important question is, why does it matter? And a way that I use to describe that, or explain that, is that the synoptic gospels are a little bit like lenses that you could put in any order in a set of binoculars. And if you get the order right, then the image is sharp and detailed and has depth. And if you get the order wrong, then it's a bit blurred and distorted. So we're incredibly fortunate to have three parallel accounts of the ministry of Jesus, because speaking as a historian, that's the kind of information that you very rarely get about ancient figures. But to make it count, we have to get them in the right order so that they produce a clear picture. Another way of looking at this is pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope. The picture on the left is, do you remember, this was before they got the mirror adjusted to the right degree, and then amazingly they were able to change that in space, and the picture just got an awful lot sharper. And since then we've seen some incredible pictures from deep space from Hubble. And I think the same thing will happen if we find a convincing solution to the synoptic problem, that things will just pop about how we understand Jesus and also the development of the first Christians. So our next question is, well, if people have been trying for 250 years and we're still arguing about it, is it solvable? And do definitely find people who think that it can't be solved. And of course, there are those who think, oh, it's definitely solvable, my solution solves it. So you have to be a little careful of people like me who think that it can be solved, but it's actually not that complicated a problem. I mean, we've only got three entities, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that means that there are only these six possible combinations if we're looking for just a really basic solution. And scholars are pretty convinced, and I think for reasons that are good, that it's unlikely that Mark used Luke, and it's unlikely that Mark used Matthew. And so that cuts down the options to just these two. And of course, the only difference between these two is either Matthew uses Luke or Luke uses Matthew. And there's been a lot of chat about Luke using Matthew and not so much about Matthew using Luke. Now, if there are really good reasons why neither of these can work, then of course things get much more complicated. And you then have to get into, well, how come Matthew and Luke have so much material in common? And we have to bring in Q at that point. But it makes sense to examine the simple solutions first before getting to the more complicated ones. Now, here is a reason for thinking that there's direct copying between Matthew and Luke. The text, which is in green, is exactly the same in Luke and in Matthew. And it's just remotely possible that by some amazing coincidence, Luke didn't know Matthew and Matthew didn't know Luke, but they both knew another text, let's call it Q, which had exactly the same text, and they copied it. They both thought it was great stuff, and they decided to copy it exactly. It's remotely possible, but it's really not probable. A much simpler explanation for text like this is a particularly extreme example, but there are others like it, is that one of these gospel writers is just copying the other. And unless there's some really good reason why that couldn't be the case, then that's the most probable explanation. So the question then becomes, well, which way around is it? This diagram here, we've got the text in orange is the same between Mark and Matthew. Text in green is the same between Matthew and Luke. This is a more complicated passage, and it's a very closely contested, much talked about passage in the study of the synoptic problem. But one way of explaining what's happening here is that Matthew knows two versions of the Beelzebul controversy, which are, well, they're talking about the same event, but they do it in a really different way. And so what he does is he tries to honor both of them. A little bit from Luke, a little bit from Mark, a little bit from Luke, a little bit from Mark, and so on, to try and weave the two together. Now, if Luke is using Matthew, he has a very different attitude to his sources. He's saying, I'm not so interested in Mark. I'm just going to follow Matthew. And it just so happens that the way he follows Matthew means that the Markan material drops out. It doesn't feature so prominently in Luke's version. So the really important question now, and where this field has been going for the last 20 years or so, is to look at what other contemporary authors were doing at the time. Because if we can see that other people were acting like Matthew does, if Matthew's last in this case, or like Luke does, if Luke is last in this case, that will be really helpful for having a more objective basis for saying that one way around is more likely than the other. And an important author is Tatian, who writes at the end of the 2nd century. The reason why he's important is because he's faced with 4 canonical gospels, and he's keenly aware of the differences between them. And he wants to reconcile those differences. And so he produces a thing called the Diatessaron Gospel. This is a really popular text. Some people treated it as the gospel for quite a long time. And so the technique he uses is going to be informative because he's doing something incredibly similar, trying to produce a single narrative out of previous narratives telling the story of Jesus. And he's doing it with amazingly similar resources. So if Matthew is last, he's using, if Matthew uses Mark and Luke, then he's sharing with Tatian very similar resources with a very similar goal. And if Luke uses Matthew and Mark, then Luke is sharing similar resources with a very similar goal to Tatian. Now, we can expect Tatian to do so, to embark on this project in a more sophisticated way and more detailed and so on, but the general principle of his approach, you'd expect to be similar for people earlier down the chain, the last most of the 3 synoptic gospels. So how does Tatian go about his project? Well, there's a few more detailed quotations here. But this is William Peterson. This is a classic text about Tatian. When confronted with, he's talking about historians in general, when confronted with contradictory or inconsistent information, the ancient historian's task was to reconstruct the true events. This was done and is still done by carefully evaluating the reliability of each account. The one judged most reliable forms the framework of the narrative. Where possible and probable, what appears less reliable is fitted into that framework. This is precisely what Tatian attempted to do in the Diatessaron. That's his combined gospel. And here's a little bit of an example of him doing that. So an example is Jesus' sayings about putting light on a stand, where all 3 synoptic sources are integrated. We've got 3 different versions of that saying. And as Zola says, Tatian manages to incorporate the objects of each instance into the Matthean form. So Matthew's providing the frame, and he's adding in the extra details provided by Luke by supplying neque before each one and by altering small details. The same technique is visible throughout the Arabic Diatessaron. So we've got a frame and it's being filled out by the other resources. And thematic grouping is something that Tatian also does. Clearly emerges as one of his redactional tendencies, his editorial tendencies. Because in the Diatessaron Gospel, he clusters similar statements and characters together. And this is a tradition which goes way back. So he's self-consciously participating in a literary tradition that has already been well established for decades. This isn't a new invention on Tatian's part. He's doing something which we have evidence for much earlier. For example, in Justin. Justin's 2 major works, material from Matthew, is cited frequently, often supplemented by or conflated with material from Luke. In many cases, the primacy of Matthew is clear. Matthew's providing the frame. The whole of the Matthean infancy narrative is recounted, at least in outline, and Luke provides only supplementary details. So with that background of how an ancient author who's engaged in a very similar project to whoever wrote last out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when we compare that with what we find in this passage here, it looks like Matthew has taken Luke as his frame for this particular passage and filled it out with extra details from Mark. There's nothing extraordinary about that. And so it's much more likely that it's Matthew using Luke than it's Luke using Matthew, which is how we get to what we're now calling the Matthean Posteriority Hypothesis. It has been known as the Vicar hypothesis in the past, named after the person who first proposed it, but this is the name that the proponents of this particular theory prefer these days. So there's a big question that you might be asking, which is why hasn't the MPH, the Matthean Posteriority Hypothesis, been tried before? I mean, it's really simple and it fits in with what we see other ancient authors doing. Well, it's a really good question. And the answer is that it has been tried before, but the fact that those previous attempts are not really registered is illustrated by this quotation from Mark Goodacre's important book in 2001, where he says the theory that Matthew has read Luke is rarely put forward by sensible scholars, and it will not be considered here. So I missed a word out there. So what he's doing is reflecting the state of research at that point. This is just an idea that people aren't talking about. So why is that? Well, an explanation seems to be that the church fathers had a really important part in the psychology of modern scholarship, because they were determined that Matthew was an eyewitness disciple who wrote his gospel first. They were really sure about that. And so Matthew was first. He was the gospel in many cases as we look at those ancient writings. And part of the motivation here is because if Matthew's an apostle and John's an apostle, they kind of provide bookends to the fourfold gospel, so that Mark, he's connected to the witness of Peter, and Luke is connected to the witness of Paul. They're kind of indirect in their apostolic attestation, but Matthew, direct apostle, John, direct apostle, that provides security for that fourfold witness. But then Gottlob Christian Storr in 1786 upset the apple cart in that he observed that Mark was first. He's the first person to put forward the idea of Markan priority, which is now a view which the vast majority of contemporary scholars accept. But if you're going to switch over switch Matthew out of first position, then it takes quite a lot of guts to put him in third position, to move him from first, where he's been for well over 1,000 years in the perception of the church, into third position. So we got there's Papias saying Matthew can't be third, and those scholars who are working in the post-Enlightenment period were pretty confident that Luke didn't use Matthew, partly for the reason that I gave just earlier on. And so that's why they came up with the two-document hypothesis, because Matthew can't be third, and Luke doesn't use Matthew, then we have to bring in Q to explain the similarities which are shared by Matthew and Luke, but which don't appear in Mark. And so the debate for the last couple of hundred years has really, well, maybe a little bit less than that in the case of the Farrer hypothesis, has really been between the two-document hypothesis, which looks like this, and the Farrer hypothesis, which has Luke using Matthew. And so the debate has been all around these question marks, and just no one's really been asking the question, well, couldn't Matthew have used Luke? And I think it's the influence of the fathers that has brought about that result. Matthew can't be third, they're saying off the side. And so just psychologically, we've not countenanced that possibility. But the truth is, according to me at least, that there is no obvious reason why Matthew can't be third. The reasons that the fathers gave aren't, they don't have a scientific basis. You can't say, oh, and when you ask scholars the question, why couldn't Matthew be third? It's really interesting what they say. So here's Chris Tuckett in 1996. He says, for various reasons, he doesn't spell what they are, spell out what they are. Matthean dependence on Luke is hardly ever advocated, though one sometimes wonders why, given the tendency of many to believe that Luke's version is very often more original. Now, the thing which I think is interesting about this quotation is that he says, one sometimes wonders why. So if there are various reasons and he knows what they are, why doesn't he tell us what they might be? But he doesn't. He just wonders why Matthew using Luke is very rarely advocated. Here's a more recent quotation from Eric Eve, book last year. The Matthean Posteriority Hypothesis has been proposed, albeit rather sketchily, by a handful of scholars such as Martin Hengel and Ron Huggins, and has been more recently explored in more depth in a book by Robert McEwen, who's been on this podcast. But it as yet has few other followers. Now, I think I slightly contest the few other followers thing. But again, I think what's interesting here is Eric Eve, he doesn't give a reason. He doesn't say Matthean Posteriority Hypothesis doesn't work because, he just says it doesn't have many followers, which is not a great reason for rejecting such a simple hypothesis, which fits in with what it looks like ancient authors were doing. Now, so there are three reasons, I think, if we're being as simple as possible, for thinking that Matthew did use Luke. The first is the verbatim copying. We've already looked at this passage. Matthew is somebody who tended to copy Mark more faithfully than Luke copies Mark. So if we're going to look for a culprit here, so the point that I think Rob McEwen made very well in your last podcast, with which he shared with Mark Goodacre, if you're going to choose who's more likely to be doing the direct copying, it's definitely Matthew. Here's a little chart which shows Luke's faithfulness to the words of Jesus in green. The words of Jesus in Mark copied directly, in Luke is not so much. The words of Jesus in Matthew, Luke would be required to copy much more faithfully. But in this case, the way that Matthew treats the words of Jesus in Mark is very similar to the way that Matthew treats the words of Jesus in Luke. So if we had to choose between those two, it seems more likely that Matthew used Luke rather than the reverse. The second reason is unpicking versus conflation. Supporters of the fire hypothesis would say this is definitely not unpicking. What's happening here is Luke is just using Matthew and Mark doesn't come into it at all. But it is kind of strange how those passages from Mark don't feature in Luke if he's taking directly from Matthew, which includes those passages. And as I say, Matthew conflating Luke and Mark together makes sense against that background of the kind of thing that Tatian does, which he does in much more detail, more finely than this example. And the last thing is that it's a lot easier for Luke's sermon on the plain to become Matthew's sermon on the mount than the reverse. So here's something that Eric Eve says in that book we just mentioned. The mechanical difficulty involved in Farrer hypothesis Luke use of Matthew is no greater than that involved in MPH Matthew's use of Luke. Actually, he's talking about the Q hypothesis there, but it amounts to the same thing, saying it doesn't matter which way the traffic is going. And that really isn't true. I can explain the relationship between the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount if Matthew used Luke really simply. Just a sentence. MPH Matthew took Luke's Sermon on the Plain and expanded it using material from elsewhere in Luke. He expanded it in the same way that Tatian and those other ancient authors also expanded their frame sources. But if you, so here he is, there's Matthew, he gets to Mark's sermon at Capernaum, and he takes Luke's Sermon on the Plain and incorporates it there and fills it out with extra material from elsewhere in Luke and other places in Mark sometimes to produce a comprehensive discourse, Jesus' ethical teaching. It's classic frame and fill technique. And then he goes back to the conclusion of Mark's sermon at the end. If we want to explain the relationship between the Sermon on the Plain and the Mount, if Luke is using Matthew, that's a much more complicated enterprise. Now, these page numbers here, that's not quite fair because sometimes they're talking about more than just the Sermon on the Plain. But that last one, a very introductory book from Eric Eve, takes 27 pages to explain the wheres and wherefores of how Luke uses Matthew, how he strips out those extra material in Matthew to get back to his Sermon on the Plain. So this is a reverse process. He takes the frame of Luke's Sermon on the Plain to create the Sermon on the Sermon on the Mount, to create the Sermon on the Plain, and then he saves a lot of material from what he finds in Matthew 5 to 7 and distributes it later on in his gospel. That requires a really prodigious feat of memory or note-taking or whatever it is to create this different order. And the effect of doing that is to make it look like Matthew's using a classic frame and fill technique. So to recap really quickly, there's really no obvious reason why Matthew could not have used Luke. It's just kind of a historical precedent set by the fathers. A direct copy between Luke and Matthew is by far the simplest explanation for their very close agreements. And MPH Matthew uses that frame and fill technique at a lot of different levels, from the big scale, like the temptations, through to the small scale, the minor agreements, like the woman touching the fringe of Jesus' garment. And generating the Sermon on the Mount from the Sermon on the Plain is a whole lot simpler than generating the Sermon on the Plain from the Sermon on the Mount. But of course, there are some counter-arguments to the idea that Matthew used Luke. Sometimes Matthew has a more original version of a saying that's also found in Luke. And I would explain that by Matthew being a conflator, somebody who's always looking for extra versions of the same story to add into his account. And sometimes he uses a source that Luke might also have used. And so he might have used it more faithfully than Luke does. So he has a more original version, but that's really not a reason for saying that Matthew could not also have used Luke. It's a really unfortunate piece of fallacious logic, which has dogged this discussion for a very long time. Just because Matthew and Luke share another source doesn't mean to say that Matthew can't use Luke. How come sometimes Matthew omits large parts of Luke? The prodigal son, or the thief on the cross, or the Good Samaritan. These are fantastic parts of Luke. Surely if Matthew knew Luke, he would make use of them. But the thing about frame and fill is what we find from other authors like Plutarch, for example. Plutarch, when he's reworking other sources to create his lives, what he generally does, he might take the polio source, and that would make up 75% of his new version. And then the extra 25% is created from lots of other relevant sources. So it's really hard to use everything that you have from the other sources. And if Matthew had done that, then he would have produced a text that was far too long to fit on a scroll. It's not surprisingly he misses stuff out. And what he misses out is actually some of the most interesting aspect of this. And maybe we'll come on to that when we chat later. You can't expect Matthew to take everything from Luke, and he's pretty consistent in what he does leave out. And why are Matthew and Luke's beginnings so different? That's a kind of the same version of the similar point that, well, if Matthew knew Luke's birth narrative, then why wouldn't he use more of it? And why is his version different? Well, I think it's possible that Matthew knew both Luke's version and another version and conflated the two together. And he tries to condense it down because he's trying to fit much more information into his scroll-length text. And why are their endings so different? Same sort of thing again, but here, Luke's ending focuses on Jerusalem, and Mark's ending focuses on Galilee. And Matthew can't have Jesus being in the same place, two different places at once in those resurrection narratives, and so he plumps with Mark. The same kind of thing you get with ancient historians. They weigh up the virtues of two contrasting versions, and they might choose one over the other. And then another which you discussed with your the debate between Rob McEwen and Mark Goodacre. Surely Luke's parable of the pounds has made a mess of Matthew's parable of the talents, not the tenants, rather than the reverse. This is just a debatable point. It seems to me that Luke's version of that story has got some very strange details which suggest it grew out of a very specific setting. Seems to be a reference to Archelaus, who was a king at a very early on in this period, much before the Gospels are being written. It seems much more likely that details that get brushed out as the text becomes more generally applied and therefore written to be more generally applicable, than that odd details of that like that get included later in the process. So that's my attempt to create a simple case for why it's Luke that uses Matthew. I mean, it's Matthew that uses Luke rather than Luke that uses Matthew. Oh, too easy an error to make, eh? And when we see it that way, I think that you get real extra detail about the historical Jesus, and also about the priorities of the church as they work through this material and try to make a whole out of it and try to defend themselves against people who are saying, well, how can you claim to have a reliable history when you've got so many different versions of the same story?
So when you look at the parables in Matthew, and there are people that will be saying that Matthew and Luke have and they try to make a case that Matthew and Luke couldn't have known each other by the argument of two other hypothetical documents, M and L.
Mm-hmm.
Saying Matthew has his own special material and Luke has his own special material from these two different documents, and that shows additional evidence, according to the four-document hypothesis, that one gospel couldn't have used the other. But when I looked at Robert McEwen's book, Matthean Posteriority, he connects the prodigal son and Luke to a similar story in Matthew about two brothers. But he says that Matthew is modifying the prodigal son story. So would you suggest from that argument that in a way Matthew does have the prodigal son, but a modified version of it? And does Matthew seem to do that often, that Matthew borrows stories that are believed to have been known only to Luke, but he's modifying the Lucan special material after all? Yeah,
it's possible. I mean, but there are cases where there's no similar parallel. So I'd have to argue that Matthew just decided to leave it out. And it's quite striking that Matthew is really not as interested in narrative as we are, or maybe we think that he ought to be. And so he tends to crunch down narrative detail as much as he can, because what he's really interested in is the teaching of Jesus, and he's trying to produce that in neat packages in his famous 5 discourses. But the thing about M and L, scholars these days tend not to talk about those sources, and also they don't have an impact on the question that we're talking about now, actually, because of course it's likely that Matthew had material that the others didn't, and that Luke had material that the others didn't, but that doesn't impinge on the question of whether there's direct copying between them. If you could find a passage in Luke which talked about Jesus teaching on the law, for example, which we know is of primary interest to Matthew, and Matthew didn't pick it out of Luke, that would create a problem for my hypothesis. I would then have to say something like, well, the version of Luke that Matthew had access to didn't include that particular bit of law. And you can make that sort of argument, but it's not a very comfortable one. But what's really striking about the relationship between Matthew and Luke in that particular department is that every scrap of everything that Luke and Mark, for that matter, have to say about the law, it really is picked up and included in the Sermon on the Mount.
In your Matthean conflator hypothesis, and we discussed this the last time that you were on here.
Yeah.
You have 3 Q's in quotes, and I know that part of it is the Didache. I know that you make the argument. I've seen some of your other videos on your blog, on your website, in which you discuss the multiple redactional layers of the Didache, and each gospel is using a different layer of it.
No, Yeah, so I mean, I think that if I had my time again, I probably would draw that diagram differently, because I think that it was asking too much for people to appreciate exactly what was in my head when I wrote those Q's in quotes. What I was trying to say there is, if you define Q as something, a source of Jesus saying is used by Matthew and Luke, then there could be lots of them, and they might be quite little documents that Matthew and Luke both used. But probably it would have been clearer to call them X, Y, and Z. And that's not saying I'm being specific about their shape or content or name or anything at all. I'm just saying there's no reason why these things shouldn't be out there. People would have been talking about Jesus in all kinds of departments, and scraps of that information would have been picked up by Matthew and Luke, and sometimes only Matthew, sometimes only Luke. Sometimes there's an overlap. The thing, as we talked about last time, Jacob, was about the Didache, because this is how I came into the synoptic problem in the first place. So I'm really a Didache specialist. I'm not a gospel specialist. And I was working on some sayings in the Didache which look very much like the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain. And as I looked at them, I thought, hey, this is interesting, because there are places where Matthew and Luke agree against the Didache, and where Matthew and the Didache agree against Luke, and where Luke and the Didache agree against Matthew. How can you make that triangle work? And the only way I could get it to work would be if Luke made a new version of the Didache sayings, and then Matthew conflated Luke's version with the Didache original. And that was my eureka moment, because then I realized that just because Matthew and Luke share a common source, it doesn't mean they're not allowed to copy each other. And it's been a really unfortunate feature of the debate that those who propose Q say, if Q, then there's no copying between Matthew and Luke. Why would that be the case? We know that Tatian copies Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Tatian sometimes has a more original version of Mark than Luke does. Does that mean that Tatian's not allowed to copy Luke? No, of course it isn't. So it's just an unfortunate piece of logic that's got in the way. But yeah, I think I'm a believer in shared sources by Luke and Matthew, and I think that an early version of the Didache is one of them. I don't think a late version of the Didache is one of them.
Do you think there could have been, could one of those Q's be the double tradition document that scholars think existed? Because some scholars that take Dennis MacDonald, for example, he thinks that he goes with the Luke knew Matthew side of things, but he says that the alternating primitivity between Luke and Matthew still necessitates Q. What do you think of arguments like that?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by Q, and that is the frustrating point. And I think that really and truly where scholarship has settled on this is Q means a document that accounts for all the similarities between Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. And that's quite a substantial body of material, about 4,500 words. So if you've got any contact between Luke and Matthew, or Matthew and Luke, then Q necessarily shrinks massively, because it's so much easier to account for most of that material shared between Matthew and Luke by Luke copying Matthew or Matthew copying Luke. So I think that, as I say, sources shared by Matthew and Luke can certainly exist, but if you call them Q, then you get into trouble because they're unnecessary. The whole point about Q as traditionally conceived is that it's a hypothesis which is made necessary by the independence of Matthew and Luke. As soon as you have Matthew and Luke knowing each other, copying each other, then that big bit of polyfiller, do you have polyfiller, fills the gap, that's no longer necessary. Because another thing that's extraordinary about Q is that it has a very sculpted shape. So it has to account for everything that's in Matthew and Luke but not in Mark. But it mustn't be too much bigger than that, because if it gets too big, then it starts to look more and more like Luke. And so it's much easier to say, well, Matthew just copied Luke. So you have a text which has got the centurion servant and the temptations, and then a lot of a teaching of Jesus, and it has to be exactly that size and shape. So if you were to go into the Judean desert and dig up a document which looked an awful lot like Q, but not quite, it missed off the temptations, the John the Baptist preaching and the centurion servant, for example, you'd still have a problem. You'd have something that looks an awful lot like Q, but how do you explain the similarities between Matthew and Luke, some of which were verbatim, almost exactly verbatim copy similarity between the two of them? It's a lot easier to say Matthew is using Luke than to say, oh, we need to dig up another document. We have to wait for the Judean desert to give us another gift.
What would you say were the top few things when you were in your early days of looking into this? What were the top few things that you can think of that really convinced you that Matthew knew Luke?
Well, as I say, it was the detail of that Didache thing for me personally, and that's difficult to explain in a show like this, rather having a detail of the text in front of us. But I think the next most important thing is the verbatim copying, because if you look at the way that Matthew treats Mark, he likes to copy him exactly, much more than Luke does. And so it just seems to me really obvious that the simplest explanation for those very close passages is someone's copying someone else directly. And as I say, which is more likely, Matthew using Luke or Luke using Matthew? Well, Matthew's in the habit of copying Mark closely, and that provides us with a template for suggesting that he's more likely to have copied Luke closely. And actually, a big moment for me was that chart that I showed you with 38% and 36%. When that came out, I thought, wow, that is seriously impressive, because of the detail of similarity about the length of strings of verbatim agreement. So the chart has, at the bottom it has short strings, at the top it has long strings. The way in which Matthew's treating Mark is so similar to the way in which Matthew would be treating Luke if we went with the MPH.
You said earlier that showing it in the Mark, Luke, Matthew order of dependency helps us understand the historical Jesus better. Mm-hmm. So what does that tell us about the historical Jesus?
Well, that is a great question. And I think that one of the most interesting, so there's a bit of information is provided by what Matthew leaves out. So it's interesting, you've got someone who presumably is, I'm dating Matthew to around about 100, 80 to 100. And somebody at that stage of the game very consistently leaves out women behaving in an unconventional manner. He refuses to condemn people just for being rich. He doesn't like people being declared righteous just like that, like the thief on the cross or the prodigal son. And what's the other one? Oh, yeah, he's got to think about Samaritans as well. The idea that Samaritans can be a good thing, Matthew always leaves out. Those are omissions that Philip West observed way back in 1968. Phil is still around and is part of our group, and he wrote an amazing article back then. But then you can see that, well, if Luke is earlier and Matthew is kind of editing out those tendencies, then there's a case for saying that either Luke or Jesus was more interested in marginalized people, poor people, women, and so on. And then the later church kind of brushed them out. Or if you switch it around, you got Jesus was pretty conventional about all those subjects, and Luke was somebody who put in more radical twist on those aspects of society. So Jesus comes out for me as a more radical figure, and Matthew makes him a bit more acceptable to mainstream, middle-class, educated people. So that's an aspect, I would say, that becomes clearer. I think it's also interesting that this is a much more controversial point, and any scholars who happen to watch this will be be throwing bricks at the screen at this point if they haven't already. But I think that I'm pretty interested in the idea that Luke wrote his gospel first off without knowing Mark, because there are so many differences between their accounts, which are really asking for trouble. If you know Mark really well, and you know that Mark has Jesus saying he's going to appear to the disciples in Galilee, then it seems to be asking for trouble to have him appear to the disciples in Jerusalem. And there are other details of the Last Supper and the Passion and the Beelzebub controversy and lots of other things where Luke's account is really quite different. So I'm attracted to the idea, and I'm kind of working on it gently, that Luke wrote his text without the knowledge of Mark and then came across Mark's gospel and thought, this has got a lot of good stuff. I really ought to include it in my gospel, which is why Luke's gospel suddenly becomes massively long, much longer than the standard scroll length, because he's got these blocks of Mark that he inserts in. But something that scholars observed 100 years ago was that if you take the blocks of Mark out, what you're left with is a perfectly viable narrative. It tells the story of Jesus from beginning to end, but just without the detail that you get from Mark. So that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Because it would give us two more or less independent witnesses to these same stories, Mark's version and Luke's version. And I think that Luke's version really could be contemporary to Mark's, possibly even earlier than Mark's. There's a big group of scholars, they call themselves the Jerusalem School. They talk about Luke being the first gospel, and I think that has some intriguing possibilities. So that's just an attempt to give a bit of a taste about the clarity and depth that we might get from a more stereoscopic view based on Mark and Luke being the beginning.
I've actually had one of those scholars on my channel, Dr. Brad Young.
Okay, yeah. Well, Steve Notley is the guy I know the best, and I think they're fascinating people. And I can't go with everything that they say, but I think they've got something important to contribute.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Garrow.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jacob.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.